I'm Adrian Jenkins from Pixel Financial Management. I've been asked to look at the work that Pwc did for County Councils Network earlier in the year, where they put together some modelling to look at what the funding gap might be for local government as a whole, but also specifically for county councils too. We looked at this partly because the spending round last month made such a big difference in what was available for local government, both in terms of overall grant funding and council tax as well. So there was a big change in 2021 that we wanted to see and look at what effect that had on the funding work that PwC had done. But also we wanted to do some more work on different funding scenarios going forward, looking at what that effect would have on the funding gap for local government going through to 2024-25. So really, we've just tried to take what PwC did and then look at what the change was in the spending round this year and then project that forward a bit further to see whether there are any funding forecasts, if we look forward into our crystal ball, what kind of scenarios or changes that we would need to actually bear down on that funding gap and see if we can get to anything that's actually funded and achievable for local government. So this is the base case that PwC put together earlier in the year. We haven't changed anything to do with the spending need forecast that they had in their modelling, but we have looked, as I said, at the funding side of things. This slide shows the most pessimistic base case that PwC had, and quite a lot of the assumptions within these numbers are actually quite pessimistic. They were assuming that settlement funding would be flat cash from 2021 onwards. They assumed no increase in council tax in Band D. They assumed some increase in tax-based growth, which we'll talk about in a second, but no increase in actual Band D numbers. And then the end of all what they called at that point the temporary social care grants that were in the system in that 2019-20. But they did include in the future IBCF funding as well as continuation of new homes bonus funding. And what that delivered was an overall cumulative funding gap of £47 billion for the sector as a whole, and almost £20 billion of that for county councils. And that was running at a rate of almost £5 billion a year for county councils, and as much as £12 billion a year for the sector as a whole. So there were some pretty big figures in terms of what the funding gap would be for the sector from those numbers. But the spending round in this year for 2020-21 was a lot better than we were expecting. It really was towards the upper end of what our expectations were. And within that, the government said that councils could increase their council tax, their core council tax, by 1.99%. Actually, PwC had assumed it would be 2.99%, so it's actually not quite as good. But then on top of that, a further 2% increase in the adult social care precept, which I think was something that none of us really expected to happen for 2021. So that puts, it's good in terms of getting more funding into social care in local government, but it does put pressure back onto councils to increase council tax further once more. Then a further £1 billion worth of social care grants, which again was something we really didn't expect. So they rolled forward all the grants that you'd had in 2019-20 and added a further £1 billion on top of that. And then continued all the existing social care grants from 1920, £650 million of social care funding, £80 million of rural services delivery grant, and £900 million worth of new homes bonus funding. And on top of that, a further 1.7% increase in settlement funding assessment, which is the overall grant funding that you get in councils. That's worth about £250 million. And then, not fully confirmed yet, but a real terms increase in public health funding and £700 million of additional funding for SEND as well. So as I said, it was a much better settlement, or much better spending round than we had been expecting. And that does have a big impact on the funding gap that PwC were forecasting. Our numbers suggested that would reduce PwC's funding gap by about half, so about 54% for CCN authorities and about 52% across the sector as a whole. And that's a really large reduction. A lot of that reduction, of course, comes from that higher than expected increase in council tax. So 17% of the national gap falls just from council tax overall. Then we looked at three other scenarios going forward. The first is just to assume that the social care funding of £1.6.5 billion, that's that's part of the new £1 billion worth of social care funding that came in 2020-21. We're assuming that continues going forward. That's not reduce in any way in 21-22. Then we're assuming on top of that just a 1.99% increase in Band D council tax. So slightly more than PwC were assuming. They were assuming a flat level of Band D going forward. Then scenario 2, we're assuming scenario 1 plus a further 1.7% increase in settlement funding assessment every year in each year going through to 2024-25. And then finally, we're taking that base core Band D increase, a further 1.7% increase in SFA, as we've said, and then finally an increase in the adult social care precept of 2% per year. So really it's just showing you what happens if, first of all, you roll over all the grants and increase Band D by 2%, then you have an SFA increase of 1.7% per year, and then finally, on top of that in scenario 3, a further 2% per year in adult social care precept. I should say as part of this, we haven't changed at all the PwC spending needs forecasts. They've just assumed that they had the methodology. We haven't unpicked that at all, so that hasn't changed. And we haven't included any increase for SEND or for public health beyond 2020-21. So what that does is that in scenario 1, if we look at that, as you recall, that rolls forward all the social care grants into 21-22, and it increases council tax by 1.99% a year. So no precept in this, just the basic core increase in council tax. And what you can see here is the funding gap for county councils reduces to £7.2 million cumulatively over the period. That's a reduction of 62%, and it falls to just short of £20 billion for local government as a whole. That's a reduction of nearly 60% as well for the sector as a whole. On balance, the larger contribution to that fund, that fall in the national gap, comes from grant. It's slightly smaller from council tax, but as you remember, in this scenario, we're looking at what happens if you do increase by grant by those figures, and there's only a 2% increase in Band D council tax. So these figures are still significant, and as you can see here, the funding gap still increases year on year over that period. Nationally, it increases from £3.2 billion in 2021 up to £4.8 billion in 24-25. And for county councils as a whole, from 1.3 billion up to 1.6 billion. So you can see it's still considerable, and it's still increasing relatively quickly year on year. And I guess one of the points to make here is that even a 1.99% council tax increase, it mitigates that growth in the funding gap, but it doesn't do anything to reverse it or to reduce it. In scenario 2, we add on top of that another 1.7% increase in the settlement funding assessment. This is the overall grant funding that you get, and 1.7% is roughly equivalent to what the inflation increase might be. This reduces the funding gap further still, but not that significantly. It's additional funding that's worth having, and it's a better SFA settlement that you've had for many, many years. To have a cash terms increase, even if it doesn't exceed inflation, is much, much better than you've had for a long time. This reduces the county councils or CCN authorities' cumulative funding gap down to 6.6 billion and nationally down to 17.6 billion. So it's had some effect, but all you're doing really here with reasonable increases in grant and a 2% increase in Band D, all you're doing there is just managing that funding gap. You aren't doing anything to bring it down. As you can see here, it's lower than it was in the previous scenario, but it's not really, it's still increasing year on year. For county councils as a whole, going up from 1.3 billion up to 1.4 billion. So you see the growth's less, but it's still a large amount of funding gap that you've got to deal with. And then in the final scenario, what we're looking at here is on top of all those, the basic 2% council tax increase and the funding increases as well, we're looking at a further 2% adult social care precepts on top of that. So that really does start to bear down on the funding gap. You can see here that all those changes together result in a 78% reduction in the county council's funding gap, down to 4.1 billion. And for the sector as a whole, that funding gap would be down by 73%, down to 12.6 billion. And this is the chart really that does illustrate to you that at that point, things do start to go in the right direction. The funding gap starts to fall. For county councils, it would fall down to £400 million per year in 24-25. It's fallen by 2/3, as you can see, over that period, from 1.3 billion. For the sector as a whole, falling from 3.2 billion down to just short of 2 billion. So less of a percentage reduction, but it's still going in the right direction, which is the first time that's happened in many years. And I think one of the key things to take from this is that the way that to get rid of that funding gap, you could argue whether that's still a substantial sum, but it's still going in the right direction. But what we really draw from these figures is that baselining the £1.65 billion worth of adult social care funding is absolutely crucial. But you do, if you're going to close that funding gap, it does require county councils and councils generally to increase council tax. We're looking at a base increase of 2% and a further 2% on top of that. And I guess one of the questions from this analysis that comes back, I guess, to authorities is that level of increase realistic? Is it reasonable? And is that the right balance between what's funded by the national taxpayer and what's funded by the local taxpayer? And my guess is that that's going to be one of the key questions that ministers will be dealing with in the next spending round when they look at how is local government going to be funded, how much comes from the national taxpayer, how much from the local taxpayer. And as we can see there, bringing all those factors into play, the grant increases and all the council tax increases, we should be in a position where we start to reduce that funding gap. There's a question about whether the spending need figures are correct, whether actually your growth in spending is greater than those forecast in the Pwc report. But nevertheless, bring all those things together on those assumptions, you do start to get that funding gap to some degree under some control. Now, of course, at the same time, we're also looking at the Fair Funding Review. That will change the distribution of funding between different types of authority. And we would hope that that actually starts to push a greater share of funding towards county councils. And I guess that's the way things will go. But that will, again, help to deal with the county council's funding gap, but it won't help to deal with the overall national funding gap. Okay, so that's useful stuff, I think, there we've managed to pull out the Pwc report and some good assumptions. Cheers.
Thank you. So I hope some of you at least are aware that we put out a report last week looking at the future of local government funding, but also looking back over the last 10 years to see what we can learn from the last decade and what the implications of the changes we've seen over the last decade could be for the future. And that's what I want to do in the next 15 minutes or so as well here, is to look backwards to help us look forward to what the next decade or so could hold for local government. So our report, when it looked back, identified 3 big changes over the last decade which could have implications for the coming decade for local government. And the first speaks to one of the questions raised in the last session, and that is that over the last 10 years, the amount of redistribution from richer areas to poorer areas done by the local government finance system has actually decreased. And that can be seen on this chart here, which ranks councils by their level of deprivation from the highest deprived on the on the right, and the least deprived on the left. And you can see back in 2009-10, spending levels in the most deprived areas were about 1.6 times as high as in the least deprived areas. Following a period of larger cuts for more deprived areas, that has fallen to about 1.3 times the level by 2019-20. Now, of course, that begs the question, what is the right level of funding for more deprived areas, less deprived areas? But you can't really answer that until you've done at least 3 things. First of all is actually decide what local government is meant to be providing. What do you expect of local government? Then do an assessment of how much different areas need to meet that, and decide how much you're willing to redistribute money around the country in order to meet those spending needs assessments. And actually that is a tough proposition to do in the best of times, but actually it's quite a difficult one to do. So we've not to talk about here about an evidence-based approach to needs assessment, and that is a great idea, but it runs into a problem. We don't actually observe needs. We need to find a proxy for needs, or we need to infer needs from what we do observe. And for certain services, you can do that. You can do a good job for that. So adult social care, children's social care, you can look in detail at what is being spent at a very local level. But for some big services, like planning, housing, culture, what the government tends to do is look at council-level spending patterns and infer spending needs from the patterns at the level of an overall local authority. And the issue that raises is, if you do that, you get quite a different answer if you used 2009 data or if you used 2019 data. So at some stage, an inherently subjective or political decision will have to be made about, is the current distribution of funding fairer, or should it go even more in terms of narrowing the differences in spending down, or was the older distribution fairer? I think that's kind of one of the first big things the incoming government will have to do in the Fair Funding Review in the next year or so. The next big change has been a great reliance on local revenue. So council tax is now about 50% of councils' non-education budgets across the country as a whole. It's more in county areas, about 60%. That's up from about a third in 2009-10. And of course, business rates are about a third of revenues now as well. And like PwC, like Pixel, we also believe that revenues from these local taxes are unlikely to keep pace with rising costs and demand for services. And I'll come on to some of our scenarios in a second, which, if anything, are a bit more pessimistic than the scenarios produced by PwC and Pixel. It's also important because the amount of different councils can raise from council tax varies quite significantly. So this graph, again, ranks councils from most deprived to least deprived. We can see the least deprived councils, on average, can raise about £336 per head from council tax, compared to about £599 per head from the least deprived councils. And I think this matters going forward because the government will continue to have a redistributive system and take into account these differences in tax bases. But what it has said is that this will only be done on a periodic basis. There'll be a reset every several years. And then in between those resets, it's up to local areas to raise additional revenues themselves. And I think that means that some of the more deprived areas in between these resets could struggle to raise as much from council tax as the least deprived areas. So I think there's a question there about, as in Wales, should the process of updating the funding system on a year-to-year take into account some assumed increases in council tax? That's done in Wales. It's not done in England. It's not planned for England. But that would be an option to think about here. And the third trend we talk about in our report is, and you'll be aware of this very much yourselves, this big focus in budgets on statutory services and social care services. So that's shown on this graph here, which shows the change in spending since 2009-10 for different service areas. So you can see adult social care and children's social care are relatively protected, but cuts of more than 40, 50% for many other service areas. Now, I think this matters again, because if further cuts would be required in the future, I think there's a real question about whether the councils could continue to protect social care in the same way it has done over the last decade. And actually, when we look over the last decade, those councils that have had to make bigger cuts have done a lot of that actually via cutting social care spending by more. Everyone's been cutting back spending on housing, transport, etc. It's social care that's come down more where councils have had to make the bigger cuts. But I think it also kind of comes back to this issue about reliance on local tax revenues. Because more and more money is going to social care, less to universal services, a much bigger part of council's budget is just directly benefiting a pretty small part of the population in local areas. An important part with high needs. But it does kind of beg the question, to what extent will council taxpayers be willing to fund big increases if they're not seeing much by way of universal services? It's being channeled into kind of a small number of high needs areas. So I think looking back actually can kind of give some guide to some of the kind of problems that could be faced in future. Now, what I'll talk about mostly in the kind of last 5 or so minutes of my talk is this issue here, the fact that local tax revenues are likely to keep pace with rising demands and costs for services. Now, why do we say that? Well, next year, actually, we think the funding situation could be reasonably good for local government. We think the extra money will more than outpace the increases in costs in the year. But longer term, there are rising demands for and costs of service provision, especially for social care. So what this table shows is the projections from various organizations about the above-inflation increases per year you need for different service areas to meet rising costs and demands. So you can see, for example, down here, the LGA PwC Institute for Government, they project about 2% a year above inflation for adult social care. On the other hand, what my colleagues for the NHS Confederation and the OBR Centre projection is costs rising by like 3.5% a year above inflation. That's quite a big difference. Now, what's driving that is that the bottom ones from like the LGA, PwC, are largely based on increases in demand. So you've got more older people, more disabled people, pushing up the costs. But the costs per person are actually not going up that much. The OBR and the report for NHS Confederation actually thinks that unit costs, the cost per person will also be increasing because of things like the rising cost of the national living wage, actually rising costs more generally in wages. If we return to more normal times, where actually wages go up rather than down. And that can make quite a big difference, as I'll show in a second, to some of the projections. The only ones to make projections for other services are, again, LJ, PwC, and IFG. And the one I'd like to note there is, what I've circled here, other services. These projections only include the rising population. The cost per user is assumed to be not changed at all. So again, I think my feeling would be that the projections coming from the LJ, PwC, and IFG are everything on the more conservative side, and that actually there's potential for costs to rise more quickly going forwards than these projections, because of rising unit costs, not just rising demands. And then we look at local tax revenues, and we also think these are unlikely to keep pace with these pressures. Now, we make some different assumptions compared to PwC and Pixel in doing our analysis. So we also look at business retention, and we also include revenue support grant and public health being rolled into a 75% business rates retention system, as is currently the plan. We have slightly lower tax-based growth. The figures that PwC used effectively build in assumptions that councils are going to continue to cut back what they spend on council tax support. That's been happening over the last couple of years. So if you take the average change in council tax base over the last few years, project that forward, you're effectively assuming councils will continue to cut back what they're spending on council tax support. We instead look at just the growth in the household numbers for our projections. And we hold the grant flat in cash terms to see how much extra revenue is needed on top of the existing grants and tax revenues. And what our analysis suggests is that billions will actually be needed to top up existing local taxes and prevent spending on other areas continuing to fall as a share of national income. So this graph shows the amounts that could be needed over the next 5 and 15 years for different council tax increases. So with a 2% tax increase, we think that around £4 billion additional grant funding will be needed for local government as a whole by 2024, about £18 billion by 2034-35. Actually, even with 4% council tax increases, we think local government might need a bit more money on top of tax revenues. The reason I differ from what was just said in the last presentation is because we're assuming faster growth in the costs, not just increases in demand, also increases in the unit costs. And we think that council tax bases, the amount you'd raise for a given amount of tax, probably won't increase quite as quickly in the future unless councils continue to cut back on council tax support. So, I think that gives kind of a couple of options for the future. Either we need to significantly improve the performance in terms of productivity in local government, and that's not an easy challenge given that many services are labor-intensive services. You cut back the amount of time a social care worker spends with the client. That might increase measured productivity. Does it increase service quality? Probably not. Either to do that, or accept councils can do even less than they do now, or we need to raise more revenues, either nationally or locally. And I think the choice about whether to raise them nationally or locally going forward really depends on what is we're prioritizing. If you prioritize redistribution between richer and poorer areas, between high needs and low needs areas, then it makes more sense to raise the revenues nationally and give them to the councils in the form of needs-based grants. On the other hand, if you prioritize local incentives, local discretion, local accountability, that's when it makes more sense to raise revenues locally through local taxation. And there are a couple of options if you go down that route we think are worth considering. You could go down to 100% business rates retention. That would raise about £6 billion additional for councils. It's quite straightforward to do, but it would leave councils with a narrow tax base, and potentially one that's going to be under pressure in the coming years. So you also suggest looking at a local income tax as a potential option as well. It's a bit more complicated, or quite a bit more complicated than business rates, but it's a lot less complicated than some other taxes you've heard about at a local level. For example, VAT or corporation tax at a local level would be much more difficult than income tax. Income tax has a bunch of desirable properties as a local tax. It's buoyant, it grows with the economy automatically. You don't need to put up rates every year. So the goose hisses a bit less when you try to, wring its neck. And it's also quite good for accountability purposes as well, in that local income tax is paid for by local voters. Some of the other options on the table have been discussed, like VAT or corporate tax. That's not a tax that's being paid by local voters, and it's probably a good idea if your local voters, local taxpayers, have a chance to vote on that in local elections. And lastly, it's about incentives as well, because actually, one of the things that we discussed earlier is that you have a changing economy. Not everything is done in bricks and mortar shops or bricks and mortar businesses anymore. Many small businesses don't pay business rates because they're in small premises. Income tax would give you incentives to kind of grow your economy in broader ways. So we think there could be benefits to looking at this, and it probably makes sense as a tax at the upper tier level rather than the lower tier level. It'd be less complex to have, 149 local income taxes than 300 odd. And the revenues from a local income tax, a £1p in the pound local income tax would raise £6 billion, which I think is twice what districts spend altogether, but is a kind of useful contribution to kind of the funding gap that counties could face. Now, I had a little bit to say about business rates and new homes bonus, but I've already gone over my allotted slot here, I'm afraid. The thing I'd say on business rates and new homes bonus is, in our report, we look at how counties and districts have done so far from both of these schemes. And you can see that in the light green is the districts, the dark green is the counties. The districts have had the lion's share of above inflation growth under business rates and the lion's share of new homes bonus payments. Now, that is by design. The schemes were thought about, districts are the ones that have the most control over local planning, and therefore they should have the biggest gains from supporting new development. But it does mean that compared to allocation of funding according to needs, while we think counties have lost out about 1% of funding from the new homes bonus, about 0.7% from the business rates retention system, districts have been pretty large gainers relative to their overall budgets. And I think going forwards, two questions for business rates and new homes bonus. One is, we don't know really anything at the moment about their impacts. Have they actually impacted local decision-making? Have they impacted on outcomes? There's no evidence at all. There's been no evaluation of business rates retention. We don't know what the impacts are there, although we do know that there's not much of a link between growth in business rates and growth in the wider economy, for some of the reasons I talked about earlier, the kind of decoupling of property and growth. And the evaluation of the new homes bonus suggests that whilst it's changing attitudes, it doesn't seem to have much an impact on changing behavior or in terms of changing strategy at a local level. So with big decisions taken next year on both of these schemes, I think there's a chance to kind of rethink what these schemes are trying to do and how they're allocated. So should more of this be allocated to counties as opposed to districts going forwards? I think actually for business rates is a good argument to do that. It would reduce the big divergences in funding we see in districts, and it would allocate some more of the growth to counties. New homes bonus, I think it depends on what we think new homes bonus is really about. Is it about incentivizing new homes, or is it fundamentally about helping local areas cope with the costs of new development? If it's about incentivization, maybe it actually doesn't make sense for districts to have the lion's share of the growth, because they are the ones that make most of the decisions. If it's about letting local areas cope with the pressures they're facing from new development, they may actually counties have a larger share because a lot of the pressures come through at the county level from roads, transport, social care, etc. And I'll end there because I'm seeing people look at me. Thank you.
Everyone, I'm Gary Fielding, and some of you may have seen that Alex Skinner was due to be here, but I can assure you I am not from MHCLG, so please bear that in mind. I've just got 4 slides, and before I just get into trying covering off some of the areas that Alex might have talked about, but given a different perspective, I just wanted to pick up some of the points from David and from Adrian. So I think if we look back on the PwC work, it was a great piece of work, proved extremely useful, but I'm probably, from a practitioner's perspective, now looking at it and thinking more along David's lines, actually, because there's some things we need to factor in. I suspect that every council represented in this room will have had numerous letters from the independent sector, the care homes, providers, saying, you've got another £1 billion, you now need to pay more money to us. And so what's happening here is, with that money comes more inflationary pressure. Had this been done over a more steady period, that might not have happened in quite the same way. So I think that's going to fuel some inflation by itself. I'm mindful we talked around evidence as well, and I think I would just want to, at the risk of making you feel slightly indignant, I want to just share a couple of pieces of evidence with you. I've shamelessly stolen this one from Adrian. This is Pixel's slide. But what this does show is, the point for showing this is deprivation's included in there, and deprivation is clearly a cost driver. But it also includes density and sparsity. And density prints 7 times more money than sparsity. And I think we need to be careful around this, because for me, density often means economies of scale, where sparsity often means delivering services, less service, more expensively. So I actually think that's a cost driver, and density can be a cost saving. And the point I would make in some of this is, that is the current formula. So there is evidence that the current formula doesn't work. So where we can't always get evidence to back up the change, the default means that's what you get. My challenge is, and I say this to CLG quite often, where's the evidence to support the status quo? So I think we need to remember that one. Another piece of information which I think is quite important as well. You'll see there at the top, you've got shires and districts, so we've merged the two together. I thought I'd stolen this one from Pixel as well, but Adrian's denying it, so I'm not quite sure where I got it from. But what you see there is the districts and counties at the top, so the 2-tier areas. You see unitary authorities below there. You've got the England average, you've got Met districts, and then at the bottom, you've got Greater London. Now, it does do the trick of starting at £1,300, so please bear that in mind. The scaling does somewhat mislead. But the point here is, that is actually the current position. And if you were, again, to map ability to pay onto this, you would have quite a juxtaposition. So again, when we look at relative needs, we're looking at what the needs of an area are. What we're not necessarily doing, though, is looking at the relative ability to pay. And for some, particularly in the inner London, so if you went into London, you could split that down into outer London, inner London, and then within inner London, you could pick out some specifically. So you'll have the likes of Westminster, who your average county can be 2.5 times higher. So that, again, is part of the evidence. So there's something wrong with the situation that we've got. How can that be right? So, moving on to the quadrilogy. Now, this is what Alex talks about. So Alex will talk about, looking at going forwards, there are 4 components. They are the spending review, Fara Funding, business rates retention, and the business rates reset. This is my penultimate slide, you'll be pleased to hear. Part of this is about transitioning as well. So, let me go through these very quickly. Spending review, that is the most important area. So, if we get the quantum right, the distribution issues will be less significant, absolutely. So I just want to share with you where SCT are looking at in terms of priorities. working with the likes of CCN, working with LGA, and again working with the likes of ADAS, ADCS and ADEPT. So we think this was great, the spending round was great. It really was a pleasant surprise, but we think there are some areas there which we need to work hard on still. And I would particularly pick out SEND, because some of you may have seen some of the guidance that's come out recently, which has suggested that any money that's owed at the end of it can be carried forward as a deficit on our balance sheets. Anyway, it doesn't look like responsible financial management. It's not something that we can sustain, and there is some challenge there. My fear is that that's because they think there's enough money in the system to deal with the problem, and that certainly isn't the case. The rise of EHCPs continues. So we do need to watch that area in particular. Just to give you some context, we reckon within the counties that the quick survey we did, the forecast deficit by 22-23 was £780 million for counties alone. So that was everyone who was in FCT, so that's 39 counties, including some unitaries. So that by itself is greater than the amount of money that was given as extra money through the DFE. So there's more work to be done in that area. Children's social care, adult social care, homeschool transport are all those priority areas. Fara Funding, the issues that we have on this are, of course, it's delayed by a year. We still think it needs to be done. We've got to keep pressing on this. What I would watch is the transition. We need to make sure that this is done, that it does get to where it needs to, that transition clearly is a sensitive issue. It needs to be managed well, but it needs to get somewhere on that. And we need to watch that it's not diluted down to such an extent that it becomes a meaningless exercise. That is a fear that we do have. Business rates retention. I just want to pick up on this area and give a note of caution. Quite struck by some of what David said. So, as treasurers, we've chatted about this quite a lot. And I think some time ago, we all thought, maybe naively with hindsight, that business rates retention was a way of escaping the clutches of Whitehall, that with council tax, business rates retention, fees and charges, we would have financial autonomy. And of course, what we've seen is that there's a lot of changes that go on in business rates. So if I was to give some adjectives towards business rates retention, confusing, unpopular, diminishing in quantum over a period of time, probably due to the popularity. So does it correlate with the areas of highest demand? Adult social care, children's social care, SEND, homeschool transport? Absolutely not. So I'm not sure that financial salvation lies in business rates retention. And if we do think about incentivisation, as David was saying, again, I'm not convinced that it was. It was interesting hearing about Essex earlier on, and when Julius Caesar and the Romans came to Britain, I don't think they'd have gone to Whitehall and asked for a business rates retention pilot before they started looking at growth and redevelopment. So I think it's something that we've all done. All councils do it, no matter what colour, what level, upper or lower tier. Growth is something that is in the DNA of councils. Business rates reset, it's so confusing. I think we need to watch this. MHCLG have made 2 mistakes in 2 years on business rates. They are the experts. If they can't get it right, what hope is there for the rest of us? So I think we need to watch that area as well. Another area which we think has been much neglected and we want to push on with, and I know that this is something that we're talking again with CCN and with the LGA as well. Capital. It's been badly neglected since austerity. We have rightly focused on revenue, but there are some areas now which, quite frankly, the chickens are coming home to roost. So there's a plea in here as well. We would like more cases, more examples from councils who think they've got good case studies on this, because evidence is needed, and we can get some hard evidence, but we also need some good case studies. A couple of areas here, and I'd welcome feedback from people outside of this session. Schools. Do we have enough places? We know there's some hotspots. We've got some case studies coming on that. The condition of our schools, forget whether or not they're fit for the 21st century, but the condition, the fabric of schools in counties is tending to deteriorate quite significantly. I'd be interested again in your condition survey work if you have that. There's also then, I heard this earlier, talking around this, with SEND, special school provision, the interactions between mainstream schools and special provision, transport costs going through the roof because provision is becoming further and further away. All of this is interlinked, so I think, again, there could be a good business case to government around that. Highways, the condition, the backlog, the thing that will get you most letters from angry residents, but also the lack of a timing horizon, a planning horizon beyond next year. We need to look at that longer-term planning. And again, in a post-Brexit environment where there's concern about what's happening to the UK economy, is that not the best time to be pushing on some of these areas? And the final one, infrastructure, unlocking growth areas. So sometimes that can be very simple. That can be a roundabout, a relief road. And as we saw earlier, business rates retention is not helping counties to fund this. So there has to be something about trying to push in those areas, and digital. So again, I'd very much welcome anybody collaring me later. If you do have some examples and you think there's an area which has been neglected in here, very much welcome to hear that.
Thank you to all three speakers. I don't think we'll have a lot of time for questions, but are there any from the floor, please? I have a couple on the screen up here, but I'll do the ones from the floor first. I can't see any hands up, but that might be the lights. Has anybody got a hand up? No? Okay. Right. First question. To provide best local services, should a 1% local income tax be paid where someone works or where they live? Who'd like to deal with that one?
So I think there's a question about how it would operate. So in most countries, local income tax, it's based on where you live. And I think one of the benefits of doing it in that way is that it has that sort of accountability link, because it's the resident that gets to vote in local elections. And also, it tends to be the resident that uses more of the local services in the business. So whilst there's an option to do it in both ways, I think it would make more sense to do it at a residence basis rather than a workplace basis.
Thank you, Dave. Next question is, business rates are seen by many as a negative factor, reference the high street. If we move to 100% retention, will this fuel government's desire to give increasing discounts at our expense?
Yeah, I mean, to me, every year since we've had local retention of business rates, 2013-14, there's been a new relief or a new discount announced, and today as well. So I mean, I think that the pressure on business rates is just so great. And as Gary said, the way they've had to deal with that to make sure you've had the funding for those new release has just made it more and more complicated. I mean, there are moves afoot to make the system simpler in 21-22, but they don't seem that much simpler to me. So I think in the medium to long term, the writing must be on the wall for business rates. And if councils are exposed to 100% of the growth in business rates, and I think it does leave us exposed to quite a lot of risk. It may also, though, give us a little bit more leverage that if we have 100% retention of all that growth, you know, government does need to replace it, I should think, with something similar. And I think as David's explored in some of his papers around using local income tax is a good idea, but I think there are other ideas as well that may fill some of the gap, like a visitor's tax.
If I may add on that, I think kind of there is obviously kind of, you know, growing pressure to do fundamental reform of business rates, and I think there are several ways in which business rates can be fixed. I think you know, there's merit in moving business rates towards a land value tax type system, because one of the kind of fundamental issues with business rates is it discourages people to invest and upgrade and improve their properties. A land value tax doesn't have that. But also there's a risk of throwing out the baby with the bathwater with business rates as well. With I think some kind of misunderstandings about sort of, you know, pretty simple economics here as well, because you know, theoretically and actually looking at the evidence from kind of across the world, the big beneficiaries of cutting property taxes are not the people that occupy the properties, it's the owners, the landlords. It gets reflected in you cut business rates, it gets reflected in higher rents. So I think as well as thinking about how we future-proof the system as a whole, how we make business rates a better tax, how we broaden the tax base of the local government, I actually think there should be, a bit more backbone when it comes to say, look, actually, no, all these exemptions, all these special cases, there's pressure for them, but we don't think they're going to work. It's going to be putting money in landlords' pockets ultimately, not saving the high street. And I think there needs a bit of backbone as well as a bit of as well as a broader tax base for local government.
Gary, final remark.
Yeah, I mean, but as I've already indicated, I think there are many drawbacks on it. And if we just think around many of our rural economies, what we see is more digital business, many of which would be a small, medium enterprise, many of which will be exempt from business rates because of the size. And so in terms of promoting growth, that's something that I think, again, everybody in this room would want to do, but it's not captured. So I think there's a risk that what it was designed or been sold on a couple of years ago is no longer the case. I think the agenda's moved on quite a lot. And what you will always have is redistribution. Business rates does not fall where eventually it will end up. So I think to try and force that issue just feels like a bit of a missell, if I'm honest.